Welcome to Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. I'm Ron Scholl. Last time on Gas, the Missoula hazmat team of Ziegler and Fiddler finally entered the spill site, along with a team from MRL who had already been there. Meanwhile, the gas still drifted, causing more late evacuations. We now continue with Part 1, Chapter 11, Assessment. Taking a breath. At 5:30 p.m., Incident Command met with Georgia Pacific reps, manufacturers of the chlorine, and received bad news. 3 cars are leaking, they said. 2 are very bad leaks. Car 1 was probably not leaking. Car 2 has some kind of break of the east end. There is heavy dense chlorine. Car 3 was believed now empty, and Car 4 had a small chlorine leak. GP warned the damaged cars cannot be moved at this time. At an evening IC meeting, Waldron announced the evacuation will go 24 to 48 hours. Considering the circumstances, such optimism was misplaced. GP's work plan for the next couple of days was to set up monitoring equipment and determine safety zones. It would be 48 hours before anyone could begin control and transfer of the leaking chemicals. The evacuation area was roughly 64 square miles, the exclusion zone drawn in a Texas-like shape, stretching from Sear Exit to 9 Mile Exit, and south on Petty Creek to the intersection with the West Fork. The hot zone was a circle less than a mile radius, with 2 ears pushing up West Mountain and Adams Creeks in a shape like a cat's head. I see. At this time, the surrounding area looks fine. The foliage is green, animals are doing fine. The gas levels have been very low, sometimes it's 0. The leakage that has occurred is evaporating. In fact, there was much visible damage to vegetation. The ongoing plume was currently small and rising, and the large cloud originally described around 5:30 a.m. had almost dissipated. This blue-gray cloud had apparently persisted all day in approximately the same area. Whatever its chemical makeup, the cloud had thoroughly saturated the Alberton area. Potassium cressolate wasn't even an afterthought. Media investigation was also underway, based mostly on official reports. GP told the Associated Press that 170,000 pounds of chlorine in one tank had released, with 2 others venting more slowly. The AP wrote, a cloud of chlorine gas hovered over the area throughout the day, and emergency officials anxiously watched to see if the plume would dissipate or move. Missoula Rural Fire Department's Bill Reed said late Thursday afternoon that the plume was stable. The reports made no mention of gas having reached at least as far east as Huson. In the local Missoulian, MRL trainmaster Dave Swanson said, it appears that the leakage right now is contained. Reed added, the cloud appears to be going straight up and is confined to a very small area. It's almost dissipated in the Alberton area. That the gas plume was stable and the leak contained was contradicted by an active leak and plume, but the major gas cloud had greatly dissipated. Waldron said monitoring would continue throughout the night and that residents east of 9 Mile Exit had been allowed home. Authorities, he said, could alert residents quickly if further evacuations were necessary. The plan to quickly alert returning residents seemed ironic in light of the reactionary evacuations that had carried the day. No local coverage informed on how large of a cloud might form from such a spill. No media reported estimated dimensions of the main cloud or on evidence of how far the gas had spread. An observer might wonder, where had all that chlorine gone? A national news report later that May claimed the cloud of toxic fumes was estimated at 8 miles long and 4 miles wide. This unreferenced report offered the only published estimate of a size of the gas cloud. However, complaints and positive chlorine readings had extended much further than this. By volume, the Alberton spill was the largest chlorine spill in U.S. rail history. With the Creslet spill, it was the largest mixed chemical spill in U.S. rail history at the time. A back-page April 12 Missoulian report said, quote, corrosive liquid sodium hydrochloride had also leaked, but only slightly and very locally from one of the cars. This appeared a mangled misnaming of the potassium creslet. A separate report generally referred to one component, sodium hydroxide, as a corrosive liquid that is used in industrial cleaning. Unreported in all news accounts was responders' belief that most of the tank of potassium cresslate had spilled, reflecting the paltry information released through officials and MRL. The cressolate was off the public radar. How far had the gas traveled? Many people were certain they smelled the gas in Frenchtown, about 16 to 17 miles from the spill, and some officials passed on similar reports before 9 a.m. without mentioning of monitoring. Deputy Joe McNeil lived in Frenchtown. He said, "You could smell it in the air, you know. It just seemed like for a long period of time, depending on the wind." When Katina and Rick Madge of Missoula drove to Frenchtown High School to locate evacuated relatives around 6:30 a.m., a smell strengthened as they approached Frenchtown. "It was chlorine and a pesticide smell as well," Katina recalled. "By the time I got into the high school, my senses were so overloaded. My eyes were already watering. I was already coughing." Alberton Fire Chief Tim Ishler's girlfriend, Dawn, lived across from the high school. She recalled that around noon, it smelled like a big giant swimming pool right in the yard, real strong, and I thought, it seems kind of silly to put people here when it's so strong smelling here. I was kind of surprised that they didn't tell people, even in Frenchtown, maybe they should be careful. Further east, Leroy Strong worked for the Montana Department of Transportation. His first exposure came around 7 a.m. while setting up roadblock signs for I-90 at the intersection called the Y, 20 miles from the spill. "We were getting hit with it pretty good there," he said, "because I was having a little trouble breathing, and so was Larry. You could sense it. It was tightness in the chest. You could feel it in the lungs a little bit, a burning sensation." Teresa Lee managed a cafe at the Y. I could feel it in my throat and my eyes were burning all day," she said. "You could smell it in the air." Jackie Spencer read meters for the Missoula Electric Cooperative. She thought she was exposed while working along the Clark Fork in the Big Flat area, over 20 miles from the spill. She developed a sore throat and an extremely bad headache, along with congestion that made it a little hard to breathe. She noticed a slight, unidentifiable smell. Others noticed a smell of chlorine in Missoula, 30 miles from the site. Beyond in East Missoula, 35 miles from the site, Carl Willig of Carl's Auto noted something in the air irritated him that morning. "There was something that definitely got me," Willig recalled. He didn't smell anything. "I'm highly allergic to a lot of things, but my eyes just became full of pus. Even if I have allergies, that doesn't happen. Harder to breathe. I got alarmed because I didn't know what was happening. It lasted that day and maybe part of the next for a little bit." All that gas had gone somewhere. A notable AP sidebar carried in Helena and Great Falls, but not in Missoula, included an interview with Dr. Fred Millar, the former toxics director for Friends of the Earth. He said the plume was at the mercy of the weather and that a full tank of chlorine, 90 tons, could travel 20 to 40 miles before dissipating. The Chlorine Institute confirmed this. No media or public account would ever document what people had smelled and where and when, or relate such information to symptoms to reveal a pattern of how the gas had spread and caused injury. There was no information relating an estimated concentration of chlorine to locations to indicate the potential health impact. By focusing mainly on the later aftermath, newspaper accounts made the spill seem localized, and injury was generalized. No one examined how the gas had behaved, but Jess Mickelson felt residents had been lucky, that if the cloud hadn't diluted with rain, it likely would have killed many more people. Dave Swanson of MRL, responding to rumors of dead animals in the area, said he had seen none at the site. He reported no sign of vegetation damage either, echoing the Georgia Pacific report. But Ziegler's video clearly showed bleached out pines. Norm Brovold Jr., holed up on West Mountain Creek, said in the Missoulian on April 15, "It's all brown down there at the site." In sum, though an initial estimate of 170,000 pounds of chlorine had spilled, and possibly more, the local consensus was that the gas had dissipated, though some minor leaking continued. Hopefully, the residents could return home in a day or two. But an important question loomed. What would be the impact on people's health to having been exposed to all that chlorine? Georgia Pacific addressed the early reported fire to Incident Command. "There has not been a fire on the site," they said. "Chlorine produces a gas that looks like blue smoke." Chlorine had been releasing all day and was never described as blue, though a persistent and puzzling bluish-gray cloud had hovered near Alberton, possibly formed during the initial release. Chlorine gas is generally referred to as greenish-yellow or white as it mixes with water vapor. GP's explanation was unique. GP and MRL had investigated the fire report. But more than chlorine had spilled. Rumors would abound for years of a fire on site on April 11, but much earlier, during the morning's evacuation. Did a fire matter? Some residents came to believe that a fire could have allowed hazardous byproducts between the chlorine and cressolate to transport off-site, accounting for smells other than chlorine. In video frame grabs taken from KPAX TV footage of April 11 around 8 a.m., a bird's eye view showed a plume of blue-white smoke appearing to rise from the south ditch about 4 car lengths west of the tanks, separate from the main plume. The vegetation was last year's grass, now soaked with potassium cressolate. Chemist Garen Smith said, "I think that's a little spot fire. I'm almost dead sure that's what that is." The grainy video revealed the same thing. Absent obvious flame, a small blue-white smoke, separate from the chlorine vapor plume, rose from the ditch. If not a fire, the bluish smoke suggested a chemical reaction involving the potassium cressolate. Exposure. Tallies would later rise, but on April 11, 120 people were treated at area hospitals, with 11 admitted and 2 in critical condition. Symptoms depended on exposure, which varied widely, but also varied among individuals because of age and health. Reported acute symptoms included irritated and burned upper and lower airways, inducing shortness of breath, severe coughing, constricted breathing, and asthma-like attacks. People with asthma or other respiratory illness had aggravated respiratory symptoms. Other common symptoms included irritated and burning eyes and skin. Hypoxia-like symptoms included dizziness, near fainting, or briefly losing consciousness. Other symptoms included severe headache, migraine, nausea, and fatigue. Among those hospitalized, some lost consciousness at times, had bleeding from lungs, and were put on a ventilator. Significant psychological symptoms included panic and fear of death. This range of symptoms was common with chlorine exposure and generally indicated significant exposure. While some people reported symptoms that abated later in the day, others felt worse into the next day or had new symptoms such as a flu-like feeling, diarrhea, severe joint and muscle pain, and infections of airways, including bronchitis. EPA toxicologist Chris Weiss said many people came to hospitals with a raspy cough, were treated with oxygen, felt better, and went home. And that night, he said, at 3:30 in the morning, they begin to drown. These patients experience what we call dry land drowning. Acid burns the lungs, tissues begin to leak. The fluid from your body goes into your lungs. This could become life-threatening. And we saw that at St. Patrick Hospital, he said, coming back in after having been dismissed with fluid leaking into their lungs. Very typical of chlorine poisoning. Criticisms later arose concerning the medical response. None of the people I interviewed who evacuated to the Frenchtown Evacuation Center and to Missoula hospitals, including responders, reported being decontaminated. Even Sam Austin, hospitalized overnight, was not told to shower, and his unlaundered clothes, which still reeked, were returned to him the next day. Issues of decontamination were not reported in the media. Another criticism concerned the perceived level of care. No doctors were available at the Frenchtown Evacuation Center, though EMT personnel administered oxygen, triaged patients, and ambulanced the worst cases to hospitals. At hospitals, some patients felt pushed out the door or left under or untreated. Emergency rooms were hard hit by the crisis and needed to focus on those patients most critical. In addition to the people hospitalized, many people reported getting medical treatment, such as oxygen and nebulizers. But with chlorine, the most important initial procedure was to get a victim away from exposure, including from their body. The failure to decontaminate Alberton victims also put at risk of contamination all those people they came into contact with, including medical personnel. The Alberton response reflected a failure to implement some basic protocol and revealed a lack of emergency planning for mass chemical exposure. Initially, exposures were broadly assumed not serious. Dr. Warren Guffin of St. Patrick's ER advised little intervention, telling 911 the treatment is basically removal from the scene. It's basically an irritant only. 12 hours later, the Rocky Mountain Poison Control Center in Denver faxed to the Missoula Health Department the most detailed medical advisory for treatment for chlorine exposure, including decontamination protocol, on the public record from April 11. The bulletin warned that delayed pulmonary edema could occur. Quote, all patients that have had a significant exposure should be evaluated in a healthcare facility and observed for at least 4 to 6 hours. Patients with underlying respiratory diseases may be at increased risk for developing respiratory complications and should be managed more conservatively. Finally, they noted whether acute or chronic chlorine exposure can cause permanent lung damage remains controversial, though it appears that most single acute exposures do not produce residual pulmonary abnormalities. Such statements regarding potential long-term effects would figure prominently in the Alberton spill. While controversial left room for doubt, the reassuring conclusion reflected the general consensus at the time. The advisory was faxed to the Missoula Health Department, but was not mentioned in the media or at public meetings. Lack of decontamination continued. The ultimate health concern for victims would be how they would fare in the long term. The first publicized health information came in the Missoulian on April 12. Missoula pulmonologists Dr. William Beckemeyer and Dr. Paul Lunan treated many of the more serious patients. Dr. Lunan assured that most people have minimal problems and few people suffer long-term lung damage from chlorine exposure. One understated point was published as an afterthought. People with asthma, bronchial infections, emphysema, or other existing lung problems are most prone to suffer long-term complications. The main medical advice was that most people's symptoms should be temporary. The list of injured included inadequately protected responders. Missoula Hazmat's Tom Ziegler thought about 15 responders were symptomatic that had to be seen by the emergency room, he said, including firefighters and deputies. That I know about. 15, 16. An ATSDR survey published in 1998 examined 23 first responders listed as 2 professional firefighters, 18 volunteer firefighters, and 1 ambulance, evacuation, and hazmat personnel each. Of these, 16 reported health problems within 2 weeks of the spill. Only 7 reported being told to wear personal protection equipment. This survey omitted deputies per se. By all accounts, Frenchtown rigs had substantial SCBAs and oxygen tanks, yet many responders had no SCBA or poorly functioning ones. Proper protection would have lessened exposure among responders, and more responders would have sped up the lengthy evacuations, benefiting residents. Steve Franklin and Paul Manson didn't know why Frenchtown didn't offer more help and protection. I.C. Scott Waldron claimed no serious exposure problems for himself. Waldron: "No, I think like lots of people that were out there, I think I had a sore throat and that kind of stuff. And I was too busy to be concerned about my sore throat. I had lots of people that I had to be responsible for as a priority, including responders not given SCBA or more help with evacuations." Holding a breath. Around 6 p.m., specialists from MTech Environmental Services arrived from Houston, Texas. MRL contracted MTech to help hazmat mitigation along with Georgia Pacific. MTech and GP teams visited the derailment site around 7:45 p.m. to assess tank damage. MTech took 12 readings near the cars, ranging from 0.1 parts per million to 112 parts per million, a deadly level, by far the highest reading of the day. Georgia Pacific reported directly to MRL that the Crestlake tank appears to have leaked approximately 2/3 of its contents on the ground and on the chlorine cars. On the cars reflected observed splatter. Meanwhile, John Fiddler of Missoula Hazmat escorted the media to view the site without respiratory protection from the vantage of I-90, 600 feet to the north. Jess Mickelson said MRL's chlorine experts advised it was safe. The EPA would later disagree. The media visit occurred as GP and MTech visited the site in PPE and measured readings up to 112 parts per million. If the wind had shifted, viewers would have had little time to react. During one of the afternoon hazmat entries, MRL signalman B.J. McComb paid an impromptu visit to the spill site. MRL had McComb return to the Natural Pier Bridge area to cut the power to the damaged lines hanging over derailed cars. While doing so, he got a call that Trainmaster Dave Swanson's vehicle was stuck in a mud hole near the leaking cars. "I drove in and pulled them guys out that were stuck," he said. "I was right in front of that, whatever that car was that was belching that shit out, 60, 70 feet away on Reardon Lane." Later, he said his trunk stunk for months. He characterized the smell on site that afternoon as a real sickening son of a bitch, noting rotten eggs and chlorine. McComb was given no respiratory protection. The sulfur smell came from mercaptans in the potassium cressolate. At 9 p.m., IC met for a final briefing at the MRL General Office in Missoula. Vice President of MRL Operations, Dan Watts, was announced as MRL's Operations Officer for the incident. The meeting noted that chemicals from leaking and damaged cars would need to be transloaded, and equipment to move the cars would arrive Friday, April 12. It became very clear that this would be no short evacuation, as earlier suggested. They noted the transload is a very slow process. The teams estimate it could be 2 to 3 weeks before evacuees can return to their homes. They feel the exclusion zone should remain where it is now. Safety first is the only concern at this time. The interstate should remain closed also. Once the transloading begins, it becomes a very dangerous operation. This news complicated the evacuation. IC noted a plan for livestock and pets will be presented on Friday. It is possible that small groups will be escorted into the hot zone to care for the animals, if it could be safely done. With the arrival of MTech and GP, MRL assumed control of operations at the site, and Missoula Hazmat's role quickly diminished to one of site safety and backup, while providing a decon unit and some chlorine monitoring. The day ended with the specialist assessment that 3 chlorine tanks had ruptured, 2 leaking badly. The potassium crestlate was believed to have lost most of its load, though this went unpublicized. The tank held 20,000 gallons. Understandably, chaos and uncertainty existed on the morning of the spill, especially in the early dark hours. But much of that story went missing in news accounts. Never publicized was the misinformation about the location of the spill and the effect this had on responders and evacuations. No news came of under or unprotected responders and the shortage of personnel. Never questioned was the speed and timing of the evacuations or the parameters of the area evacuated or the fact that evacuations took place after arrival of the gas. A broad picture never emerged of how the gas had spread on April 11. No newspaper or official ever publicly questioned where had all that gas gone. The gas simply dissipated. Also missing from all news accounts and public records was any mention of lack of decontamination of bodies, clothes, pets, or vehicles. Without argument, many responders risked their health and lives on April 11 and would later receive commendations from the state. Noted one observer who heard about Terry Fairbanks tirelessly cranking the alarm at the fire hall, "That just breaks my heart, that she was afraid for other people and stayed and did her job. She's the hero in my book." The same could be said for all the Alberton volunteers, including the Walshes, who had little or no protection. Gordon Hendricks singled out one other person. B.J. McComb is the one that, if anybody should have been sick, it should have been him, Hendricks said. He is the unsung hero as far as I'm concerned. The railroad never thanked him, never did a thing. He was going back, evacuating, telling people to get the hell out of there. Not one mention of the man. And of course, BJ is not that way anyway. It's just a fact. His life was in danger there by what he did. One could also give incidental credit to train engineers Caswell and Shutter. By escaping, they eliminated the need for a highly risky rescue, especially by responders without protection. However, if their engines had not broken free, the confusion and response delay over their location might have cost them their lives. While the sun set on the initial response, many people exposed to the spill stood on the cusp of an arduous journey. Next time on Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. The night after the spill, people in the west end of the evacuation zone complained of smells and symptoms, but they remained not evacuated. And while responders prepared for a long evacuation, residents grow concerned over animals left behind. Till then, this is Ron Scholl. Thanks for listening. This podcast is adapted from the book Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. Visit Amazon.com to see the 2-book series. To access support material in the book, such as maps, photos, illustrations, and video links, visit my Facebook page Gas, the true story, or watch my Gas playlist on my YouTube channel at RL Scholl.